The airport was bustling, every corner filled with the sound of rolling luggage, overhead announcements, and the occasional distant shout of frustrated travelers. Keanu Reeves stepped quietly through the sliding glass doors, his presence calm, unassuming, almost blending in with the crowd. But the immigration officers behind the counter didn't know who he was. They only saw a man approaching with a passport and visa. One of them, a young officer with a smirk plastered across his face, leaned back in his chair and whispered to his colleague, "Think he really belongs here?" The words were casual, meant for private amusement, but Keanu heard them anyway. He said nothing at first. He simply walked up to the counter, placing his documents carefully in front of the officer. The line behind him tensed, some travelers glancing over curiously, sensing the tension in the air. The officer lazily flipped through the pages of the passport, rolling his eyes. "Next time, make sure you're in the right line," he sneered, barely suppressing a laugh. "This counter is for important people." Keanu didn't react immediately. He didn't glare or raise his voice. His expression remained calm, almost serene. There was no hint of anger, no sign of frustration, just a quiet, steady gaze. Other travelers felt it too. There was something unusual about this man. The way he carried himself, composed, unshaken, unaffected by disrespect. The line whispered. Some reached for their phones, quietly capturing the moment. 9 minutes passed. 9 minutes of subtle tension. The officer, still smirking, made more remarks under his breath, assuming no one could challenge him. But Keanu simply waited, observing every action, every word, every flicker of arrogance in the man's expression. The air seemed heavier with each passing second. Every glance from Keanu carried weight, though no one could explain why. People in line shifted uncomfortably. Some tried to ignore it. Others could not. Then came the quiet realization. The calm man in front of them wasn't just any traveler. Every subtle movement, every composed glance suggested he had authority far beyond what the smug officer could imagine. And in just a few more minutes, that authority would become painfully, undeniably clear. The officer laughed again, thinking he was untouchable, but the room itself seemed to lean closer, waiting, as if the next moment would change everything. And it did, in ways no one in that line could have predicted. The immigration office was a hive of activity. Travelers shuffled in from different gates, dragging rolling luggage, clutching passports, and murmuring impatiently to themselves. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, bouncing off the polished floors. Somewhere, a monitor displayed flight arrivals in cold blue letters. But in the middle of it all, an unusual tension had begun to form. The officers behind the counter were loud and confident, their energy sharp and commanding. They moved with authority, speaking to travelers with clipped tones, their arrogance magnified by the small power they wielded over each person in line. Some staffers nearby avoided eye contact, while others whispered to each other about who they'd seen come through today. Keanu Reeves moved calmly through the crowd, carrying only a small bag and an air of quiet assurance. There were no bodyguards, no entourage, no flash of fame, just a man walking with purpose, observing, taking in the officer's energy without disrupting it. It was the contrast that mattered. The officers noticed him immediately, the way he didn't rush, didn't try to cut in line, didn't demand special treatment. They misread his calm for weakness, a blank canvas on which they could project their superiority. One officer leaned back in his chair, smirking, and whispered to his colleague, "Let's see how long it takes him to crack." Keanu reached the counter and placed his passport on it with a steady hand. The officer glanced down, rolling his eyes. "Do you even know which line you're in?" he said dismissively, not even bothering to look at him fully. "This is for important people." The other travelers in line stiffened, sensing the tension. Some glanced toward Keanu, recognizing him immediately, though a few pretended not to. Others didn't know who he was, but felt the weight of the interaction anyway. Whispers spread quietly, like a ripple in water. Keanu's calm was deliberate. He did not respond to the insult. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he maintained a steady gaze, scanning the room, noting the officer's arrogance, noting the reactions of other staff, noting every small detail. Time stretched. 9 minutes passed slowly, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension in the air. The officer continued his dismissive remarks, laughing under his breath as if the power he wielded could never be questioned. But every second spent under Keanu's watchful eyes began to erode his confidence. Even if he didn't notice it yet, other officers exchanged nervous glances, some avoiding the line entirely. The office, filled with travelers and staff, seemed to lean toward Keanu, waiting. Something about the way he carried himself commanded attention, even without a word being spoken. Keanu finally spoke, quietly and politely. "Can you tell me why you're speaking to me this way?" His tone was calm but firm, each word measured, deliberate. The officer faltered, caught off guard by the question. No one expected this calm confrontation, this quiet challenge to authority. It was a small moment, just a man standing quietly, asking a simple question. But the energy in the room shifted. The arrogance that had filled the office moments ago began to falter. For everyone watching, it was clear. This interaction was no longer about who held a title or who wore a uniform. It was about composure, authority, and respect. And in that office, the scales were slowly tipping. The officer tapped Keanu Reeves' passport with a careless flick, his smirk growing wider. "This isn't really your line," he said, leaning back as if daring Keanu to react. "You might want to wait your turn somewhere else." Keanu's eyes didn't waver. Calm, steady, and unshakable, they met the officer's gaze. He said nothing at first. His silence wasn't submission, it was assessment. The office had grown tense. Travelers in line shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to each other. Even the other officers behind the counter had paused, sensing the energy in the air was no longer ordinary. The officer laughed again, a short, dismissive sound. "What, you're going to argue with me?" he jeered, confident he still held the upper hand. "You think fame gives you the right to skip the rules?" Keanu's jaw didn't tighten. His hands remained relaxed on the counter. Every subtle movement exuded control, patience, and authority. "I'm not here to argue," he said softly. "I'm here to understand why you're speaking to me this way." The room shifted imperceptibly. The officer's smirk faltered for a split second. It was as if the weight of Keanu's calm had landed without effort, yet impossible to ignore. People in line exchanged glances. Phones began to appear, quietly recording, capturing the tension without anyone daring to interrupt. Another officer, watching from across the counter, whispered nervously to a colleague, Maybe we should check who he is." The first officer's arrogance only increased for a moment. "You think you can tell me how to behave? Look around, buddy. I run this counter." Keanu finally took a small step forward, measured, deliberate, not threatening, not aggressive, just a subtle reminder that he occupied space now. His presence alone made the officer hesitate. The line behind them murmured quietly, some travelers leaning back, as if the room had shrunk around the confrontation. "You have authority here," Keanu said, his voice still calm. "But authority doesn't give the right to disrespect. Not me. Not anyone." The officer's lips pressed together. He tried to recover, laughing nervously, but the sound came out weaker than intended. It was the first crack in the mask of arrogance he had worn so comfortably. The subtle authority radiating from Keanu was impossible to ignore. Other officers began to glance at their documents and computers, uneasy. Patrons whispered, "Is that Keanu Reeves?" A few recognized him immediately. Some didn't, but even they could feel the shift in energy, the quiet force in the room that made everyone pause. Keanu's words didn't shout. They didn't demand. Yet the effect was undeniable. The arrogance, the smirk, the false confidence, all of it was slowly crumbling. The officer's smirk had faded entirely, replaced by a flicker of unease. By the end of the 6 minutes, the room had changed. What had started as simple disrespect had turned into an intense study of composure and authority. Travelers and staff alike could sense the imbalance. The officer no longer dominated. Instead, Keanu's calm, steady demeanor controlled the space, a quiet force that needed no volume to assert itself. In that moment, it became clear. The officer's power wasn't permanent. Respect, composure, and authority were measured differently than he had imagined. And in the next few minutes, everything would change, faster than anyone could have predicted. The minutes stretched slowly, almost unbearably, in the immigration office. Travelers shifted in line, their eyes darting between the two figures at the counter. Some whispered softly, others stared openly. trying to make sense of the tension that had built so thick it felt almost physical. Keanu Reeves remained calm, unshaken, his posture composed but commanding, a quiet storm in the center of the room. The officer who had been mocking him tried to laugh again, louder this time, attempting to reclaim the energy he'd once owned. "You think you can just," he began, only to pause mid-sentence, noticing something he hadn't expected. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. It wasn't just steady. It was evaluative, piercing, and imbued with an authority that didn't need shouting. The line behind them murmured again. A young traveler whispered, "Isn't that?" but quickly stopped himself. Others began to pull out their phones, subtle camera angles, catching the subtle but undeniable confrontation. The tension wasn't escalating violently. It was something far more powerful, control through calm. Keanu's presence had turned the room. The officer's arrogance, once as thick as the badges on his uniform, now seemed brittle, fragile under the quiet force before him. Every flicker of a smirk, every twitch of a shoulder, betrayed uncertainty. Even his colleagues noticed, glancing nervously at one another, as if seeking confirmation that what they were witnessing was real. "Do you understand why this behavior is unacceptable?" Keanu asked, his tone low and deliberate. Not a shout, not a threat, just an observation, a statement, a boundary. The words cut sharper than any raised voice could have. The officer's face tightened. He opened his mouth to reply, but found the words lodged somewhere between embarrassment and incredulity. His smirk was gone. His posture stiffened. He had expected fear, flattery, or compliance, but Keanu had shown none. Only quiet authority. Only patience. Only clarity. Other travelers watched in awe. Some began to record discreetly. Some stared in disbelief. Whispers spread across the line, almost uncontrollably. "That's Keanu Reeves. He's handling this calmly. I can't believe he's letting him talk like that." The air was thick with collective recognition. Something extraordinary was happening. The officer attempted to regain control, slamming his hand lightly on the counter. "You're wasting everyone's time," he barked. But the sound was hollow now, lacking the conviction it had once carried. The room had shifted. The energy was no longer his to command. Keanu leaned slightly forward, just enough to be heard clearly. "Respect isn't about titles. It isn't about uniforms. It's about how you treat people. And right now, your behavior is unacceptable." His eyes held the officer's, steady, unflinching, revealing an unspoken truth. Arrogance has consequences. A few other staffers whispered urgently to the supervisor, who had been watching the scene unfold from across the office. The supervisor approached cautiously, noticing how the officer's confidence had collapsed. The realization hit slowly but firmly. The disrespectful behavior had been exposed, publicly and undeniably. The officer's friends, colleagues who had once laughed with him, now averted their eyes. The room had turned against him, without a single person needing to speak loudly. Keanu's calm had done it all. Then came the final moment. Keanu handed his documents to the supervisor, his posture still relaxed, his tone measured. "I hope steps will be taken," he said softly. "Disrespect should not go unaddressed." The supervisor nodded, already making the calls necessary. The officer's arrogance had evaporated. The room held its breath, knowing change was imminent. The subtle power of quiet authority had revealed itself. Keanu stepped back, not a muscle wasted on threat or intimidation, and turned toward the exit. Travelers in line exhaled collectively. Phones went down. Conversations resumed, but everyone present felt the weight of what had just happened. A lesson had been delivered. Patience, composure, and quiet strength could dismantle arrogance faster than aggression ever could. 9 minutes of observation, calm, and subtle authority had toppled a tower of misplaced confidence. And in those 9 minutes, the office, the travelers, and the officers themselves had all learned something extraordinary. Respect isn't demanded. It's commanded through presence, patience, and principle. The air in the immigration office had shifted completely. What had begun as arrogance, smugness, and casual disrespect had now turned into unease, tension, and quiet fear. The officer who had mocked Keanu Reeves only moments ago now sat stiffly behind his counter, trying to maintain a sense of authority that had already slipped from his grasp. Every passenger in line could feel it. The dynamic had changed, and no one dared interrupt the silence. Keanu had remained calm throughout, observing, listening, and speaking only when necessary. But even in his quiet composure, the shift was unmistakable. The supervisor, who had been watching from a distance, finally approached. His expression was serious, attentive, and quietly intimidating. Someone who understood the weight of the moment and the influence of the man in front of him. "Mr. Reeves," the supervisor said, a note of respect in his voice. "I understand there's been an issue here." The officer's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His colleagues shifted nervously. They had all witnessed the quiet dismantling of authority, and now it was clear that the consequences were real. Keanu handed over his documents, his expression still calm, almost serene. "I expect respect here," he said softly, "for all travelers, not just for some." The supervisor nodded and, with a discreet gesture, made a few quick calls. By the time he was finished, the situation was resolved, but not in the way the officer or anyone else had expected. The officer's colleagues were asked to step aside. Some had murmured protests, but the tone of the office had changed. Everyone knew what was coming. The officer himself tried to maintain his composure, but the sweat on his brow and the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. Within minutes, official notices were quietly delivered. The officer who had mocked Keanu Reeves was being removed from his post. Not loudly, not with spectacle, but with absolute finality. Other officers involved were also disciplined. It was an instant, decisive action, triggered not by anger or revenge, but by principle and authority. Travelers in line watched in stunned silence. Some gasped softly, while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. They had witnessed not only the confrontation, but also the immediate, undeniable consequences that followed. The lesson was stark. Arrogance and disrespect have limits, and sometimes the person you underestimate holds the power to change everything in an instant. Keanu collected his documents, his wife standing by his side, and simply walked toward the exit. No raised voice, no dramatic gestures, just a calm, steady walk that conveyed more authority than any shouting or confrontation ever could. Behind him, the office was quiet, employees exchanging uneasy glances. The smug officer, once so confident, now understood fully what it meant to misjudge someone. The weight of accountability pressed down in a way he would not soon forget. Outside, the sun was setting. Travelers continued their journeys, but the story of the office would not be forgotten. Phones had recorded the encounter, and the footage was already spreading quietly among passengers and employees alike. It would travel beyond the airport, a testament to how quiet authority and composed presence could achieve what anger and aggression never could. In just 9 minutes, Keanu had turned a situation of disrespect into a lesson in accountability, composure, and principle. The officer who had dared to mock him had not only lost face, but also learned a harsh truth. The world respects patience, intelligence, and quiet power far more than it respects arrogance. Keanu Reeves stepped out into the evening air, calm as ever, leaving behind a transformed office and a lesson that would echo far beyond those 9 minutes. The people who had witnessed it, directly or indirectly, would carry that lesson with them. True authority is quiet, and respect is earned, not assumed. The airport had returned to its usual rhythm by the next day, but the memory of the incident lingered like a quiet hum. Travelers moved through the terminal with their rolling luggage. Employees completed their shifts, and announcements echoed over the speakers. Yet, for those who had witnessed what had happened with Keanu Reeves, nothing would feel quite the same again. The officer who had been removed from his post sat at home, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He had expected to be untouchable, to wield authority freely, to dismiss anyone who didn't meet his arbitrary standards. But in a matter of 9 minutes, everything had changed. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a humbling awareness of his own misjudgment. Every detail replayed in his mind. The calm in Keanu's posture, the quiet firmness in his voice, the way the man had asserted authority without raising it. Other officers in the terminal had been reassigned as well. Some murmured their frustrations. Others were quietly reflective, understanding now that power was not simply a function of rank or uniform, but of character, composure, and intelligence. Even those who hadn't directly witnessed the encounter had heard the story. The tale spread quickly among airport staff. How one man had dismantled arrogance with nothing more than patience and presence. Meanwhile, Keanu and his wife had already returned to their lives, carrying the air of normalcy that had marked their approach from the beginning. He didn't seek attention for what had happened. There were no interviews, no dramatic statements, no viral videos posted by him personally. The moment had been handled, the lesson delivered, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes could be observed throughout the terminal. Staff members greeted travelers with more attentiveness, treated requests with genuine care, and were noticeably more conscious of how they carried themselves. Travelers reported friendlier interactions, and the culture of arrogance that had once gone unchecked was quietly shifting. Small acts of kindness, patience, and respect became noticeable, almost contagious. The officer who had once mocked Keanu found himself reconsidering his approach to authority entirely. He began volunteering to help new hires, practicing patience, and taking note of how he interacted with travelers. It was a slow process, but the lesson had taken root. He had learned that authority is meaningless without respect, and that respect cannot be demanded. It must be demonstrated and earned. Even outside the airport, those who had observed or heard about the incident carried the impact with them. Social media clips, recounted stories, and quiet discussions in lounges and waiting areas highlighted one simple truth. Composure, quiet authority, and principled behavior matter far more than bluster, arrogance, or public displays of dominance. Keanu's approach had been subtle, almost invisible to some, but it left an imprint far greater than any loud confrontation could have. The calm, collected way he handled disrespect became a benchmark, a reminder that influence and respect do not need volume to be effective. And as he moved forward, undisturbed by the incident or the chaos it had temporarily caused, Keanu demonstrated a simple, enduring principle. True authority comes from character, not position. Real strength lies in patience, not aggression, and the quiet lessons, when delivered with presence and integrity, can change not just one person, but everyone around them. The office had been transformed, the lesson absorbed, and those who witnessed it would carry that understanding into every interaction thereafter. Respect, patience, and quiet authority had won the day, and the impact would last far longer than the 9 minutes it had taken to teach it. The immigration office had returned to its routine, travelers moving through the line, passports being stamped, announcements echoing overhead. To an outsider, it looked like any other day. But for those who had witnessed what had happened 9 minutes earlier, the atmosphere carried a subtle but permanent shift. Keanu Reeves had left quietly, as he always did, without fanfare or dramatics. No cameras, no shouting, no declarations of victory. He didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered and absorbed, silently, by everyone present. Authority had been asserted not through anger, but through calm, measured presence. Respect had been demanded not with threats, but through dignity and principle. The officers who had been removed or disciplined felt the impact most acutely. The arrogance that had once seemed unshakable was gone, replaced by reflection and, in some cases, remorse. They had learned, in a way that could never be undone, that positions of power are meaningless without integrity. The quiet, unwavering authority of one man had dismantled their sense of superiority in a way that loud confrontations never could. Other staff in the office had been inspired as well. They treated travelers with more care, listened more attentively, and approached their work with a renewed sense of responsibility. It was subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer, but it was real. Change had begun. It didn't need to be shouted. It only needed to be witnessed. Travelers who had observed the confrontation carried it with them too. Some shared their experience online, describing the calm, commanding presence of a man who handled disrespect without aggression. Others told friends and family, recounting the lesson in patience and composure. The story spread quietly, organically, teaching that true influence doesn't demand attention, it earns it. Keanu's wife, who had been the unintentional target of the insult, never needed reassurance. She had seen the lesson firsthand. The world, as chaotic and unpredictable as it can be, had shown its power through restraint and integrity. Strength doesn't have to shout. It can simply exist quietly, and the impact is far more profound. The moral was clear. Respect is not automatic. It is not demanded through titles, uniforms, or bluster. It is earned through character, calmness, and consistent integrity. Anyone can command attention, but few can command respect. And those who try to take it without giving it often find themselves exposed. The incident became a quiet legend among airport staff and travelers alike. Not for the celebrity, not for the dismissal, but for the principle. The moment demonstrated that composure can outweigh aggression, patience can outweigh pride, and quiet authority can outweigh arrogance. For everyone watching, the lesson was simple and enduring. The person you underestimate today may hold the power to change everything tomorrow. Influence is not measured by who raises their voice the loudest, but by who acts with dignity when the world is watching, and when it isn't. Keanu Reeves walked away as he had entered, quietly, composed, and confident. The officers had been held accountable. Respect had been restored, and the ripple effect, subtle but lasting, would continue far beyond the walls of that immigration office. Speech balloon type respect if you believe that true strength lies in humility and calm authority. Share where you're watching from. Every comment is read and appreciated.